Hi, this is Alex Mozed, founder and CEO of Applico, and we are here on Winner Take All, where we talk about all things tech, modern monopolies, and how do you capture these network effects and these winner take all dynamics. Today, we're going to go over a recent research report that was published talking about what consumers are willing to pay for a lot of free platforms that you use. This is interesting in the debate of is privacy a cost, and how much does privacy cost the consumer? We're going to do a little platform 101, talking about what are the 7 ways to solve for the chicken and egg problem, this very big challenge of getting consumers and producers and vice versa, and then continuing to do that many times over. What's the true story of Amazon's marketplace origination story, right? Jeff Bezos published a letter showing that they've had GMV since, I think, 1997. But what was the real truth behind the marketplace back in the late 90s, and how did it actually get going? We're going to take a little look at B2B as it relates to building materials and the electrical industry. And then we've done some analysis on the 70 public platform stocks in Platt, the platform ETF, looking at their age, when they went public, what the, really just what is the kind of duration or life cycle of these platform companies relative to things like the S&P 500. Mastercard in recent news just announced they're buying Nets, a European payment company. What's that all about? We're going to dig into that. Zillow is going to announce earnings at the end of the day today, and they have a new program called Zillow Offers, which we're going to dig into, which is pretty interesting. Etsy released earnings last week and announced a few interesting new initiatives that we're going to dig into. And Match just announced earnings this morning and had a huge beat, primarily on the heels of Tinder. And we're going to dig into that as well a little bit more. So let's start at the top. There's this interesting report that just came out here that you can see on how much consumers are willing to pay for a lot of free apps that you would be familiar with. YouTube at the top, $4.20 a month. I mean, that's a lot. That's $50 a year. And by the way, when you're doing surveys and asking people how much they're willing to pay, people don't like to say that they're willing to pay for something. So I would argue these are actually probably underestimated, underrepresenting what people would actually be willing to pay, because I don't think people are that truthful when filling out this kind of information. But if you look at the roughly 15 to 20 companies on here, YouTube, Google Drive, Facebook, LinkedIn, FaceTime, Reddit, Venmo, Instagram, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, Twitter, Pinterest, Snapchat, Yelp, all platform companies. Which ones are not really platforms? Google Maps. I'd say Waze could kind of be a collaboration platform, joined by Nick Johnson, co-author with me on the book, Modern Monopolies. Waze is kind of platform, but not Google Maps, right?
Well, Waze has a lot of this user-generated content. People are basically inputting where police showing up. They're constantly giving their data back to the platform on traffic times,
crashes, speed traps, cameras.
And Google Maps sucks in a lot of that data from Waze, but there's a lot less of that kind of user input on Google Maps. It's a lot more
they have a badge
government
system
sources
on Waze,
and private partnerships and this kind of stuff, and there's much less of a user input aspect to that.
Exactly. Yeah, and Google Translate, that's a good linear tool, but not a platform. So basically, all these platforms are free. This goes back to the whole conversation about even if these antitrust regulators successfully say that the tech monopolies are inappropriately using your data for privacy reasons. Okay, what is the cost of abusing your data and violating privacy rules? Okay, prescribe some cost to that. Now look at this data. Look at how much consumers are willing to pay for these things that are free. And I guarantee you, whatever cost is prescribed for privacy abuses will pale in comparison to what these users are willing to pay.
Well, the challenge with that too is that you talk about the value of your data. Your data on its own is really not worth very much. It's what Google, Facebook, and so on are able to do with that data by matching with all these other people's data. So you have to get back to the challenge of how much you actually, if you had to pay for this data, how much are you going to pay each person? It's not going to be very much. So that's not going to make up the difference. And then what we really have here is not this kind of red herring where you are the product because it's free. You have a barter exchange, which is what this is really getting at, which is there's value to these things that you're using. You are getting them for free, and in exchange for that value of that service, you give up some data.
Exactly. And last note on this, Amazon, I think, had this thing. I don't remember the exact details, but I saw it was like they pay $10 for your data or something like that. I don't really remember all the particulars, but they spent $10. I know that. And every single one of these apps, every single one of these people are saying they're willing to pay more than $10, right? Yelp at the bottom, $1.87 a month, more than $10. So basically, the privacy argument that these things are horrible and antitrust and we need to break them up, it's just not going to win. So moving on. Let's actually, while we're talking about Amazon, what is the origination story on the Amazon marketplace, Nick? You know, I think a lot of people, and even in Jeff Bezos's letter, it's a little misleading for him to say that they actually had true 3P third-party sellers on the marketplace in the late 90s. Why is that?
Well, the marketplace as we know it today didn't actually start until after Amazon went public, I think in about the year 2000, and then it started to launch internationally in Europe in 2001, 2002. And that marketplace as we know it today, basically where you go on, there's the buy box, third-party sellers come in. That didn't start until after Amazon went public. What happened earlier, and if you remember back in the late 90s, eBay was all the rage. Everyone thought the auction model was going to dominate online. Amazon had its 1P first-party seller model, and they thought we need to go create an auction product. So Amazon invested a lot in basically building out the technology to support this and tried to compete head-to-head with eBay. So they had a handful of, compared to what they have today, handful of third-party sellers basically coming on in this Amazon auctions.
More partners.
Right. Well, that was third party. It was a marketplace, but it was like eBay and auctions marketplace. And it never really got traction because they were going head to head with eBay. And eBay was the dominant auctions marketplace. Where they ended up getting traction is basically they shut down the auctions model and then shifted to eventually this marketplace model, which we know today, where basically it's third party sellers selling you at a purchase price. And that has become the dominant model for buying products online, even to the point where on eBay today, 90% of the stuff that they sell is at a buy now, essentially purchase price rather than an auction.
You're saying late 90s GMV that Jeff reported is really auction 3P sellers.
Yeah, they had a handful of 3P partners and that kind of stuff. But in terms of what was actually a marketplace in the late 90s on Amazon, it was this Amazon auctions product.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So a lot of platforms have this challenge of, I need consumers to get producers if I'm Uber. I need customers to get drivers and vice versa. And then especially if you have a hyper-localized network effect like an Uber, my drivers are only located in one location, then that problem continues to compound upon itself, not just in one region, but in every region. And how can you essentially hit this point of critical mass where then the network effects actually start working for you as opposed to against you? And so what we outlined in the book and have written extensively about are the 7 different strategies for solving the chicken and egg problem. And basically, there are 3 buckets to this. We started to talk about this on yesterday's episode, but there's monetary subsidies, there are product features and product subsidies, and then there's user sequencing and other kind of incentives that come along with that. So the first one here is enter with significant pre-investment. So you could think about this for development platforms, like when Microsoft or Sony's PlayStation is entering a market, they will announce that we have a huge marketing budget. We have hundreds of millions of dollars that are now going to boost all of these sales of our hardware. And what that's really saying is that we're going to juice demand for this product, because now I can instill confidence in my producers, which would be the third-party game developers, so that they can now justify making an investment to have games ready at launch for an Xbox or for a PlayStation. Otherwise, it's hard to build the confidence in producers to make that investment before they can actually see how much demand there is for your given console in that example.
So you're basically guaranteeing the demand side of the equation for those producers with this strategy.
Exactly. So the other one here is to build a cooperative strategy. And basically what this is saying is, how can you bring together multiple players in an ecosystem? The example that we've talked a lot about here is Google and what Android did with the Open Handset Alliance, where it was actually a multi-sided marketplace where there was the Android operating system, but you need the operating system for a phone to run with handset manufacturers. And so there's other players in there as well, like telecoms, chip manufacturers. And so what Android was able to do is create this alliance, what we call this cooperative strategy, where you say, yes, at the end of the day, there are producers, which are developers. There are consumers, which are people buying a phone and then using those apps. But the cooperative strategy is then looping in other complementary players into that ecosystem as well. In this case, handset manufacturers, telecoms, chip manufacturers that are all going to then make Android their priority mobile operating system.
Right. And if we remember back in 2008, 2009, iPhone had just come out. It was exclusive with AT&T, I believe, at the time, and all the other telecom companies, phone manufacturers were scared that the iPhone's going to take over everything, and they didn't have a response to this. So Android basically said, all right, we'll give you the operating system. You guys are going to sell phones based on this. We're going to own the platform. And basically created this armada of companies that were all basically anti-iPhone and Apple, and then AT&T at the time, who had the exclusive rights, to come up with a response to that. And that's what Android really was. They got all these groups to work together because Google didn't want to do all of that by itself.
So another one here, looking at product features, kind of product subsidies, right? So classic one here is just to act as a producer. If I need to seed a marketplace from scratch and I want to capture demand, then I usually maybe don't have supply. So how could I act as a producer? How could I kind of intimate supply to jumpstart that initial demand? So an example that we've used many, many times over would be looking at when Apple first launched the iPhone and what are those initial apps. The iPhone was out for about 1.5 years before it actually opened up to third-party app developers, but it still had the phone app, the text app, the mail app, the calculator app, the number of key apps, Safari, that would provide this utility to the consumer, where Apple was able to kind of jumpstart the demand in that scenario. Other examples would be Uber, where Uber would enter a market and maybe didn't have drivers initially, but they would go and actually contract drivers and probably pay them hourly to then be the initial drivers in a market so that they could start booking rides.
That's what they did in San Francisco. When they initially started, basically, they just paid drivers to sit in downtown San Francisco and then said, hey, look at this app. You can go book a black car on demand at any time. And it's because the cars were being paid to sit there. It wasn't until much later that the kind of true marketplace model came in. When they had enough demand, they could start to sign up groups of drivers and individual drivers. And then really with UberX, of course, that took off. Basically, anyone with a car that could operate got onto the platform.
So the other one here is an evolution strategy. And what we mean by that is very often what you see is there are existing complementary ecosystems that you would love, your platform would greatly benefit from, or shares a lot of synergies with the existing, with this other ecosystem. So there's been a lot of press, and we've written about it in the book, about how in the early days of Airbnb, they would go and then post on Craigslist to get demand. They would post their listings on Craigslist to get people who want to book those listings. And then they would also try to capture supply. They would message the people that have posted listings to rent their apartment on Craigslist. And then they would message them to come and post that on Airbnb. And basically what you're doing is you're tapping into another ecosystem and trying to siphon that off to your ecosystem.
Right, where you're more focused on a particular type of thing or producer, whereas Craigslist does a lot of stuff. Airbnb particularly did, home rentals and partial home rentals, and basically focused on that particular subset of consumers and producers, and really was able to siphon off a lot of that demand and provide more services around that to those customers.
The interesting thing with this is that we've seen a lot of stories about competing platforms doing this to each other's networks. What you're also seeing is that these platform conglomerates, when they really become a conglomerate by definition, now what they're doing is layering a platform business on top of another platform business. So if you look at Uber, Uber is essentially doing an evolution strategy internally. Google, Facebook, Amazon, all of the big tech monopolies are doing this all the time. They have entire incubation labs where they have teams and teams of people. And their whole business, or their whole directive, is to, how can I siphon off this existing either consumers or producers and channel them into a new platform business. So we've talked a lot about how Uber has done this with Uber Eats and now Uber Freight to then take one or both sides of their existing ecosystem for Uber Eats. That would be the consumers and then the drivers that are then helping to fulfill those delivery orders in a three-sided marketplace for Uber Eats. So we've seen this where it's very competitive and the platforms are doing it to each other. And we've also seen this now where the platforms, as they get to very large scale, are doing this internally and actually using an evolution strategy to try and become a platform conglomerate. So a couple strategies that blend together actually both of these activities would be to create a single or double-sided Marquis strategy, right? So who are the high-value users that when you attract these users, they are then going to kind of energize a broader base of similar users.
Right.
How would you expand on that?
If I'm Twitter, do I need celebrity users to join? Because if I'm a celebrity user, I'm going to have millions of people follow me. Whereas, you know, if some random guy on the street signs up, he might get 4.
Like what
so it's a big difference in the value of a specific user. And then, yeah, Microsoft
with Mixer just did taking Ninja from
absolutely.
Twitch. Oh, now I'm going to get this very high-powered producer. And not only could that get me a lot of other producers, but it could also get me a lot of Ninja's followers and consumers.
Right.
And that's the double-sided.
It's basically acknowledging that certain users or types of users are more valuable to building the network than others and really focusing on acquiring those users first. And in some cases, you know, paying them directly in terms of partnerships, as I'm sure Microsoft is doing with Ninja.
And on a similar strain, but a little bit different, then there's how can I target a single user group that actually fulfills both my consumer and producer functions? And we've written extensively about Etsy doing this, where they realize, oh, you know, I have producers that are creating products and I have consumers that want to get these handmade, handcraft products. But then they started to look at the data and they said, wow, some of my most avid consumers and customers are actually my creators.
Right.
And how could I just really laser in on getting a strong creator following? Because not only are they going to give me supply, but then they're also going to go and buy and give me demand on my marketplace.
Etsy actually started by basically looking at and messaging people on craft goods forums. So it was, you know, typical kind of basic forum on a website or like a Reddit subreddit. And they would go in and talk to these folks and found that a lot of the people that were actually buying stuff were the same people that were selling stuff. So there's a lot of overlap there. And rather than having to go get, all right, let's get the supply on and then get a bunch of these consumers, just put them together and let them buy from each other. And then you can start to bring in more and more demand as you get that supply on there.
Yep. The last one is probably my favorite because it's the easiest and just most repeatable trick in the book. And that's what we call providing single user utility. That's what we call, basically what you see is that technology is a commodity and every platform will happily give away the technology for free if they can get access to the ecosystem. And so we've talked about OpenTable, how in the old days of OpenTable was really just a kind of like inventory management system for restaurants so that they could manage, you know, their bookings and their seating charts and all that kind of stuff.
Right. It was all done even at top restaurants when OpenTable started, again, back in the kind of the .com era, pen and paper. So there wasn't really any computer systems or even kind of like legacy systems for managing this stuff. It was, let's take reservations. Someone calls us up. We write it down on a chart with tables and that kind of stuff. And you know, OpenTable basically said, this is silly. Let's make a software system to do this. Once we get that in a lot of the top restaurants in San Francisco where they started, then we can open up the reservation side. Even if the reservation side never comes, you still have this tool. So you're going to join because you want access to this tool.
And you can subsidize the cost of the tool because you know that you're going to actually monetize the transaction, the core transaction. Instagram did this where it's just really, if you remember Instagram was really just a photo editing app that would let you put filters. And then they added in the social network content platform dynamic. In recent news and what you're going to see Google do with Android Automotive is exactly this and Waymo. So Waymo is Google's autonomous driving technology. And what Google is doing is using Waymo as the hook, as what we would call linear hook, the single user utility to say, hey, car manufacturers, your autonomous driving technology is horrible compared to ours. But don't worry, we will give you access to Waymo if you install our operating system in all of your cars. And then I make money on the transaction connecting the software developers, this community of third-party developers that will obviously be ready, willing, and waiting to come onto Android Automotive. And then they're going to be able to monetize all the services that are going into the connected vehicle. It's genius, and it's going to be awesome. And there's nothing that these OEMs are doing about it, unfortunately. But, I got to give Google a lot of credit for really crushing single user utility.
Where they've had a lot of success too are those smaller OEMs. So not the GMs of the world and Toyotas of the world. It's the smaller guys that don't have their own big autonomous driving units that they're already working on their own technology. They don't have their own kind of operating system for the vehicle that they're creating. It's really these guys that they don't have it. So Google says, look, we'll give it to you. Just come put it in your vehicle and you get all this stuff.
Right. Exactly. So there's been a lot, I think everyone's probably heard. There's a lot of reports like this report here. Technology is killing off corporate America. Average lifespan of companies is under 20 years now. The average age of an S&P 500 company is under 20 years, down from 60 years in the 1950s. Whoa, kind of scary, right? Here's what's interesting is, so we analyzed of the 70 companies in Platt, when were they founded? When did they go public? So what's the average age? What's the median date that they IPO'd and these kinds of things? And here's what we found. So the median year founded was 2000. The average age was 28 and a half years. So average versus median, which is really interesting if you think about it, because the average age of an S&P 500 company is now sub 20 years, but the average age of a public platform company is 28 years.
I think you have some probably on either ends of the spectrum that are skewing that fairly heavily. You have the Visas, Mastercards,
yes,
and
American
Amexes
Express
of the world,
is very
and New York Stock Exchange, those kinds of companies
yes,
that have been around for a long time and have been very successful.
Ritchie Brothers.
But part of why they have been around for a long time and so successful is this platform model, and they found a way in a 20th century world to make that model work very well, and then in the 21st century model, still going very strong.
So that's why if you look at the median, 2000, right. Okay, 19 years.
Right.
It's actually pretty much right there.
Yep. You're going to have a lot more. I would guess that median and average will come down a little bit over the next few years. You have a lot more of these platform companies from this sort of latest late 2000s and the early 2010s kind of wave of companies that are now going public.
Yeah, so maybe that'll come down. But it's kind of interesting that it's actually somewhat similar lifespan to me, right?
Yeah.
And guess which business model is stronger and better, and I would argue has a much longer longevity? Platforms, right? So the lifespan is coming down for the S&P 500 companies, which are predominantly linear and much more traditional, not platforms. I think we said there are 21 platforms in the S&P 500,
right?
And now it's somewhat similar to the age and lifespan of the platform companies, just in general, not just the ones in the S&P 500. We can cover that on the next episode, but I think these are just much stronger companies. So median year of IPO was 2011. So again, these companies are still so new, 7-8 years now from when they've IPO'd. We don't have all of the latest platform companies that have IPO'd this year or will be IPOing this year in the ETF yet. It'll be rebalanced, I think, at the end of the year, and then those companies will get in there. But it's still just so new or so early in terms of when these companies have IPO'd, separate from the ones, and really the ones that are in the S&P 500 are actually the really much older ones, like the American Expresses and the Mastercards and the Visas that have been around for a long time. So that was pretty interesting to me. On the note of Mastercard recently, just I think maybe today, announced they're buying Nets, a payment that it's a division of this payment unit for $3 billion. It's their largest acquisition ever. Mastercard has talked a lot about how they want to get more into payments, B2B payments. We spoke yesterday about how the Fed is a platform based on its payment platform with FedWire, with the wire system and all these things, and that banks recently have created this thing called the clearinghouse, which is actually a private bank consortium funded competitor basically to the Fed's wire and payment platform system. And what this, I think, is just continuing on that trend for essentially kind of subverting the Fed, and the Fed has just been slow. They really haven't updated this.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily subverting. I think the Fed's idea is we need to provide a public alternative. So I think that the private one exists and is functioning today. I think the Fed's going to take a little while to get to theirs, 2024, 25, something like that. But I think that basically the Fed says we need to provide a competing platform. I think what you're seeing with Mastercard here, basically there's two things. One is B2B payments, which is big, and the other is cardless payments. So that this company allows them to do is direct account-to-account payments for B2B.
Right.
You've seen this
really a B2B
growing
focus.
In a big way internationally, basically cardless payment systems enabling direct payment transactions that are instantaneous and settle right away. And this is a big move in that direction for Mastercard and B2B, where I think they have a lot of growth opportunities.
Lots of growth in B2B payments. The Nets business still has their merchant processing, so like credit card terminals and other stuff like that. But this business definitely has the network effect dynamic that Mastercard is looking to capture. So on the trend of B2B, let's talk about a couple B2B segments here. So starting with building materials. Building materials, B2B distribution has a variety of different verticals. Building materials being one of them in the US has over $100 billion in value and throughput every year. There's a lot of fragmentation in the building material industry that covers all of the products that are going into homes or new construction jobs, also lumber and all the related supplies that are helping to build the homes and buildings of today. Amazon has not gotten into building materials in any kind of serious way recently. Right. It's definitely a heavy logistic fulfillment type of industry, which I think has kept out a lot of the Amazon, Walmart, Alibaba, and eBay type of tech platforms from coming into the space. There are things that are on the fringe and more commoditized, more pack and shippable in building materials. Right. But the large majority of it is definitely heavier, which is just harder for them to penetrate from a logistics and fulfillment standpoint. But what are the other things that you've been looking at in this space, Nick?
Yeah, I think the part of the reason you haven't seen Amazon get into this, it's an industry that has a lot of local network effects because of that heavy shipping component. Basically, if I'm a building materials distributor, I typically only ship the heavy stuff within maybe at most a couple 100-mile radius of a distribution store. Because once you start to get further away, the further and further you get, the higher that fulfillment cost is going to go up. So if, for example, there's a lot of these kind of e-commerce type websites for building materials, if I try to order something like 500 pounds of, or 500 square feet of siding, and I want to get that delivered, the fulfillment cost can be upwards of 20% of the actual cost of the good. And that's prohibitive for making that model kind of work because they're shipping it from centralized warehouses that's too far away from where I am. And it just doesn't make unit economics just don't make sense. So what you need to do in a lot of these more heavy material industries in B2B, which doesn't fit the Amazon model of having one warehouse that can serve a big area, is really you need to have a lot more local supply. So you need to get up a lot of these smaller distributors, of which there's a lot, and really figure out how you consolidate them together into a marketplace and leverage their local fulfillment capabilities rather than having everything run through a more centralized kind of hub and spokes model. You've seen a lot of these businesses pop up in emerging markets. So you have a number of these things popping up in China and India, in markets like that. I think a little less so in the United States, where I think you've seen Supply Hog, which never got a lot of traction and got, I think, acquired for a small amount. But definitely see a big opportunity for distributors to get into this because they have the footprint, they have the customers, and they have the tools that they could offer, speaking of kind of single user utility, in terms of things like financing, inventory management, tracking deliveries that a lot of these smaller shops just aren't going to have. So there's a lot you could offer to bring these smaller shops on board and really extend the footprint of what you're able to serve.
And I think, a couple things. So what we have seen in the industry, we've seen a lot of consolidation.
Yep.
We've seen a lot of the mid to large size players gobbling up the small to mid size players. We've even seen large players gobble up large players.
Yep.
CRH, which owned Allied in the US, that was sold maybe a year or two ago now for a handsome sum. And so you've seen a lot of consolidation at the top of the industry. And I think one of the reasons that companies like a CRH and which is a European holding company, and they also do a lot of manufacturing. I think you're seeing a number of companies that are in the manufacturing space of building materials that maybe also had a distribution arm that was built up over the decades. And they're kind of saying, you know, I feel like some disruption is coming. I feel like there's definitely some new marketplace type of models on the horizon. And I just don't want to play in that game. I want to stick to making products. And the distribution businesses were kind of a bolt-on over the years anyway. Yeah. And so I'll let that stuff go if I get a nice price. And by the way, they're getting nice prices. So, I mean, if I'm a small, mid-sized player and I could exit right now, I'd probably exit, right? Take me out of this, because there's going to be a lot of shakeup. And I think there's a lot of older owners. There's a lot of just older folks that have been in the space, and change is hard and challenging. So there's going to be change. It's just a matter of when it comes. It's inevitable because there is fragmentation. There's a lack of pricing transparency. The buying process is very arduous.
But if I'm a general contractor and I'm trying to get materials, it's not clear to me how much something's going to cost, what's available, without having to call up a bunch of folks. It takes a lot of time, and there's no easy way for me to get that information, and a marketplace really could come in and solve that quite well. And I think the large incumbent distributors would actually find that a lot of these marketplaces start at the bottom of the market, and they might be seen internally as somewhat competitive or cannibalistic to the core business, maybe in 2 or 3 years after the marketplace is going. But at least initially, I bet there's a lot of small contractors in the LBM industry that are not even on the radar of the large distributors. They're not the kind of customers that they're just from an economic standpoint set up to serve. Right. Those customers are not well served by the current sort of large distributor system. Right. Those people in particular would love a marketplace. And you could basically have this be accretive, certainly in the early stages. At least in the early days, while you prove it out and get validation of it. So another B2B distribution vertical here is the electrical distribution space. We've published some research in the past on the level of fragmentation in the industry, and there are large B2B electrical distributors, but they don't account for enough of a consolidation in the industry to prevent a marketplace from coming in. So it's a $160 billion a year industry. That number might be a little low. This is from a year or two ago. The 20 largest companies in B2B electrical distribution only account for about 40% of the overall market share. There are over 14,000 companies that are less than $10 million a year doing electrical distribution. That screams heavy fragmentation. And whenever there's heavy fragmentation, that is ripe for a B2B marketplace to come into the space. What are some of the areas within the electrical industry that you would say from a product catalog standpoint are particularly ripe or commoditized for a marketplace to take advantage of that? Yeah, I think if you have to look no further than Amazon Business, this kind of electrical and supplies is a big area for them already. Lighting, which is a big area of electrical, is a huge category on Amazon, one of the largest and fastest growing if you look at number of sellers and products in the Amazon Business catalog. Then you also have stuff like wires, connectors, all these kinds of small products, smaller motors that Amazon does that kind of pack and ship stuff very well. It's very easy for them to ship that to a wide range of places. They have a lot of third-party sellers already on the platform for this. And if I'm a B2B distributor selling these kinds of products, what is my unique advantage? These things are fairly commoditized. They're fairly standardized. Amazon's going to have more of them, and they're likely, if they don't already, going to have them at a better price because they have a lot of these smaller sellers competing against each other. Yeah, I think if again, I don't own a B2B electrical distribution business, but if I did, I would say it's got to be at least 40% of their SKUs in their product catalog are what I would call pack and ship. And probably more, but again, I'm not in it. But at least if it's at least 40% are pack and ship, which I would say puts you in a pretty commoditized bucket, fits almost
exactly into the Amazon fulfillment and distribution model. That's not a good thing.
We did do analysis on some of the large distributors a couple of years ago as Amazon Business was starting to get traction. And that percentage is roughly right in terms of what we saw in terms of pack and ship type of items, commoditized items, and then also layering in sort of spot buy behavior. This is a big part, if I'm a electrical, an industrial distributor, this is a big part of my business. And just doing e-com is not going to solve going up against a big marketplace like Amazon.
Right, because the value prop of a B2B marketplace is twofold. One, you get the widest product catalog selection, right? Because I have all these third-party sellers. They're putting in their inventory. I'm going to be able to add many more SKUs than I would if I literally have to buy the product, have it on my balance sheet, have it in a warehouse, handle the fulfillment and logistics of it. But no, if you get that ecosystem, you're going to have a wider product catalog selection, and you're going to just have more competitive prices. And what do customers want? The best price and the widest selection of choice. When it comes to value add service, which has typically been the response from the MRO, the electrical distributors that are having to talk to analysts on earnings call and explain why Amazon isn't as big of a threat as it actually is. Usually they use the value add service as a reason why. And one interesting story about what Amazon Business won recently is Stanford University. Stanford University is supposed to be a hallmark example of a large customer that needs a lot of high touch value add services, right? Which is supposed to be a hallmark client for large B2B distributors. As to why that's defensible against an Amazon. Well, okay, how did Amazon penetrate this? Stanford has like 20 different colleges. They all have all their own different procurement requirements. And Amazon has all the tools, procurement tools, they said cut down 50% of the labor costs to comply with all the procurement tools that they could then segment out to all the different departments within Stanford. That was kind of point one. Point two is that Stanford has all these requirements about sourcing products locally. So this is where they're presented a problem where you would talk about value add service. So Amazon basically said, well, if you can't find, say, a minority owned product or a locally sourced product on the marketplace, we're going to give you one or two people and you send what you need to them, and then they're going to go source it and put it on the marketplace, and now you can fulfill your order.
And by the way, Amazon has filtering on its marketplace for those kinds of things. So if you have specific buying criteria saying you need to buy a certain amount from minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, these kinds of things are available in terms of B2B buying experience on Amazon Business.
Yes. And so I know some equity research analysts that when they learned about this Stanford University win for Amazon, they started to actually take out from their earnings analysis that the defensibility attributed to the value add service that large distributors were touting as a moat, basically, from a marketplace. But again, to me, it's more of a question of how much of the electrical distribution industry does a B2B marketplace own or control? Is it more like a 30-40%? Is it more like a 60-70%? It's going to be one or the two. And it's just a matter of at what level of scale and over what level of timeline. But not only is it inevitable, it's actually already happening. You already have Amazon. You already have eBay Business, Alibaba. And I think Walmart is now pushing into B2B, and electrical is definitely going to be on that list of things. So there's a threat, but there's also a huge opportunity for electrical distributors to take advantage of this. So, okay, let's keep moving here. Zillow. Zillow, if you don't know it, it's a great platform that you can find all different sorts of home information, real estate purchase information. And we would classify it as a service marketplace, or
connecting you basically with real estate agents who can help you find a house.
Yes.
So the main thing on the consumer and producer. On the consumer side, basically, you have someone looking to buy a house. On the producer side, you have real estate agents. The platform basically connects the two together.
Yeah, so service marketplace in that regard. What Zillow announced, Zillow is announcing earnings at the end of the day today. I think they're going to beat, and here's why. So Zillow last quarter announced this thing called Zillow Offers, which is direct home sales. And they've just announced, just as of maybe yesterday, they've opened in their 15th market, and they're expanding this rapidly. What is Zillow Offers? Zillow Offers is basically a linear program. And so what we love with platforms it's not just platform. The best place for a platform to be is a hybrid of platform and linear. And when you can figure out how to put the two business models together, that's really when you're the strongest. That's an Amazon with 1P linear selling and white label products and 3P third-party sellers. It's an Apple creating the phone and the hardware, but then having the ecosystem of third-party developers, right? This is Zillow's linear business model, where they're saying, hey, if I put a Zillow offer price on your home, you can just go in and say, sure, I'll take that money. Pay me. I'm going to sell you my house, Zillow. Right. And so now Zillow is using all of the data and machine learning and intelligence that it has to be able to predict, if I was to buy this house at this price, I have a pretty good likelihood that I could flip it, maybe do some light improvements on the house, and then make a good profit on that.
Isn't there a big startup? I forget the name.
Does this for cars?
Right. It does this. There's one that's doing this in homes as well, but they don't have the marketplace to go along with it. So their access to data and ability to actually support this kind of business and get the cash flow they need to continue if, say, there's a downturn.
Open Door. That's right. Yep. I was going to say Nextdoor, but I knew that was the social network. They formed an alliance with Redfin.
Yep.
So I think Redfin should probably just go buy that business.
Right. Very, very similar idea, except here Zillow's home growing this rather than basically partnering or
doing it on their own. Open Door has raised $1.5 billion. But what you got to keep in mind is they're using that $1.5 billion to actually fuel they need the equity capital to do the purchases. It's kind of like the lending marketplaces that would raise a $500 million debt round, but they're using debt.
It's raising a fund basically to go and actually operate the business.
You're essentially raising a fund.
Right.
And I bet if we were actually look at the cap table of an Open Door, it'd probably be split out like that. I'm raising this capital to kind of give you a return on the capital, as opposed to I'm using this capital to acquire customers, build out sales teams, invest in tech and IP and these kinds of things. Very different purposes. So I actually think probably Open Door could be still acquired at a decent sum for Redfin, which is also in Platt, Redfin and Zillow, and basically a Zillow competitor. So I think Zillow will beat. We'll see. I'm right or not shortly. Etsy came out with earnings last week, and the CEO was recently talking that he thinks this is their breakthrough quarter. And one of the big reasons why, or I think there's a few different reasons. I think the biggest reason is shipping. We were talking yesterday about, and many times, the killer app for product marketplaces is shipping. We've seen this with Amazon, 2-day, now 1-day shipping. Etsy is now rolling out a program to say, if you buy something, if you have an order over $35, we'll give you free shipping. The sellers have kind of been complaining about that. And I saw some surveys of sites saying, hey, do you think it's good? Do you think this will be good for Etsy if they offer free shipping on orders over $35? Absolutely. If they offer free shipping on orders of $35, is that a good thing for Etsy and juicing demand and getting customers to purchase? It's just one less kink in the purchase flow, and it's entirely the right decision to make. I think the challenge for Etsy, similar to eBay, is they don't have the level of fulfillment and the warehouse infrastructure. They don't have these products.
Fulfillment as a service the way that an Amazon fulfillment does.
So doing the actual free shipping is just, you have to use a UPS, a FedEx, one of these other third-party carriers. It makes it much more expensive to do that. Yeah, it's just much more challenging. So last topic here for us today is everyone's favorite dating app, Tinder, owned by Match Group, owned by Barry Diller from IAC. Barry, you're a genius. Okay, Match Group is way up today, even though the rest of the markets are actually absolutely tanking. But Match Group is up. Why is Match Group up? Basically because of Tinder. Match Group owns Match.com and other online dating websites. Match is in the ETF. So basically the reason why for the big beat is that they had originally forecast 1 million new users for the year of 2019. They've now upped that expectation to 1.6 million. And really attributing that large beat to Tinder. Makes sense. It's just the mobile version of a Match.com.
It's really the dominant dating platform today.
And I think the big thing here is that they launched Tinder Lite, which is on a lot of like Southeast Asian countries, South American countries, much lighter version for Android.
It uses a lot less data. If you've if you ever used Tinder, full disclosure, I met my fiance on Tinder, so it worked for some people.
We have a true live Tinder story right here.
Swiping, you get a lot of pictures basically that are being downloaded on your phone. It takes a lot of data. So a light version of it is going to be much better in emerging markets where data is really a prohibitive cost. So it's a good move by Tinder. You've seen a lot of apps like Facebook has a Facebook Lite that it uses in emerging markets. Yep. It's really a key thing to being successful in these kinds of markets. And
look, it's definitely a winner-take-all market, right? I mean, Tinder, if one competitor kind of slightly might be able to break out from the crowd, then they just buy them. And so it's absolutely a winner-take-all market.
What you see is there's a lot of, and this is part of what Match Group has, a lot of these niche markets that go after particular types of users, or particular subsets of users based on identity, ethnicity, these kinds of things, where they have a lot of these subset groups. But if you're looking at kind of the generalist marketplace, Tinder is definitely the dominant one today.
Yep, exactly. Well, and on that note, Nick met his fiance on Tinder. So happy Wednesday, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.